Welcome back to another incredible story that proves appearances can be deceiving. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from today. Now, let's dive into a tale that shocked a courtroom and reminded everyone why you should never judge a book by its cover. In the marble-lined halls of the federal courthouse in Chicago, where justice and law intertwined daily, no one expected an ordinary Tuesday morning in 1995 to become one of the most memorable days in the building's history. Judge Richard Blackwood, known for his strict adherence to courthouse protocols and somewhat controversial interpretations of the separation of church and state, was about to meet his match in the most unexpected way. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7A, where Pope John Paul II sat quietly, his presence commanding attention despite his attempt to remain inconspicuous. The Holy Father wasn't there for a major case or a headline-grabbing lawsuit. Instead, he was present for what should have been a routine civil matter concerning church property. Around his neck, as always, hung his papal cross, a symbol of his office and faith that had been with him through countless journeys and personal trials. Judge Blackwood, a man whose 62 years had been dedicated to maintaining what he considered proper courtroom decorum, noticed the religious symbol immediately. His steel-gray eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses, and his reputation for being particularly strict about religious displays in his courtroom was about to take center stage. Rachel Cooper, the court reporter with 15 years of experience, sensed the tension building. She had seen that look in Judge Blackwood's eyes before. It usually preceded what the courthouse staff had come to call his constitutional lectures. Her fingers hovered over her stenotype machine, knowing this morning was about to become anything but routine. Cardinal Thomas Bennett sat beside the Pope with the composed demeanor of someone who had navigated countless diplomatic challenges. He had advised the Holy Father about Judge Blackwood's particular stance on religious symbols, but there was never any question about the Pope removing his cross, not as a statement, but as a matter of faith and office. The courtroom was relatively empty that morning, with only a handful of people present for various minor cases. Elizabeth Morgan, a veteran journalist who had covered the courthouse for nearly 2 decades, sat in the back row. She had come for a different case entirely but found herself witnessing what would soon become an extraordinary display of legal knowledge from an unexpected source. "Your Holiness," Judge Blackwood's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the courtroom, "I notice you're wearing a religious symbol in my courtroom." His tone carried the weight of authority and a hint of disapproval. In this courthouse, we maintain strict neutrality regarding religious expressions. The room fell silent. Officer James Sullivan, the court bailiff, shifted uncomfortably. The idea of challenging the Pope himself over wearing a cross seemed almost surreal, yet here it was happening. Through Sister Anna Rossi, who served as his translator, Pope John Paul II's response was measured, respectful, but carried an underlying strength that anyone familiar with his role in world history would recognize. "Yes, Your Honor. It is a symbol of my office and faith." Judge Blackwood's gavel tapped the bench, not a full strike, but a warning. "I'll have to ask you to remove it or face a contempt charge and a fine." The judge's voice carried the finality of someone used to having his orders followed without question. Andrew Parker, the assistant district attorney present for other cases that morning, watched with growing interest. He had seen Judge Blackwood's strict interpretations before, but something about this moment felt different. Catherine Wilson, the judge's newly appointed law clerk, quickly began pulling relevant cases on her tablet, anticipating the need for legal precedents. But what happened next would render her research unnecessary. Pope John Paul II, the man who had helped bring down communism and had faced countless challenges in his life, straightened in his chair. His expression wasn't confrontational. Instead, it carried the calm confidence of someone about to reveal an unexpected hand. "Your Honor," he began in English, his Polish accent clear but his words precise, "I believe we might need to discuss Cantwell v. Connecticut, 1940, and the Supreme Court's ruling on religious expression in public spaces." The change in the atmosphere was palpable. Judge Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly, the only visible crack in his stern demeanor. Elizabeth Morgan leaned forward in her seat, her reporter's instincts telling her she was about to witness something extraordinary. Cardinal Bennett suppressed a smile. He had known about the Pope's extensive knowledge of constitutional law, a side of him the public rarely saw. Years of dealing with international law, concordats, and various legal challenges had led the Holy Father to become well-versed in legal matters, particularly concerning religious freedom. Through Sister Anna's occasional assistance with more complex legal terms, the Pope continued, his tone respectful but firm. Furthermore, the Supreme Court's decision in Murdoch v. Pennsylvania established that religious expression, particularly when tied to religious office, falls under protected speech. Gregory Phillips, the senior court administrator who had stepped in to deliver some paperwork, found himself pausing at the door, captivated by the scene unfolding before him. Here was Pope John Paul II, the leader of the Catholic Church, calmly citing Supreme Court cases with the precision of a seasoned attorney. The morning had started with the potential for conflict but was transforming into something else entirely, a reminder that knowledge, respectfully presented, could bridge the gap between differing interpretations of rules and rights. As the morning sun continued to fill the courtroom, those present realized they were witnessing more than just a minor civil proceeding. They were seeing a demonstration of how knowledge, respect, and understanding could transform a potential confrontation into a moment of revelation. Bishop Michael Collins, who had been quietly observing from nearby, watched with a mixture of pride and amazement. The Pope's deep understanding of American constitutional law was something few people knew about, but it was about to change the dynamics of this courthouse encounter dramatically. The tension in the room had shifted to anticipation. Would Judge Blackwood maintain his strict stance, or would the Pope's surprisingly scholarly defense change the course of this unexpected legal debate? The answer would prove that sometimes the most powerful arguments come from the most unexpected sources. William Hayes, who had seen thousands of cases in his 27 years as courthouse security, knew he was witnessing something unprecedented. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows seemed to highlight the historic nature of the moment, casting both the Pope and the judge in its revealing light. Sister Anna Rossi watched with quiet pride as the Holy Father continued his legal argument, occasionally providing translation assistance but largely allowing his own voice to carry his defense. This was a side of Pope John Paul II that few had witnessed, the constitutional scholar beneath the papal robes. The story of what happened next would soon spread through the courthouse and beyond, reminding everyone that true strength often lies not in physical power or authority, but in the ability to stand firm for one's rights through knowledge and reason. The tension in courtroom 7A had transformed into something entirely unexpected. What began as a simple civil matter had evolved into a masterclass in constitutional law, delivered by none other than Pope John Paul II. The pontiff's calm demeanor and precise legal knowledge had caught everyone off guard, especially Judge Richard Blackwood. Assistant District Attorney Andrew Parker leaned forward in his seat, his legal pad forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. In his 15 years of prosecution, he had never witnessed anything quite like this. The man before them wasn't just reciting memorized cases, he was demonstrating a deep understanding of constitutional principles. Your Honor, the Pope continued, his Polish-accented English carrying both authority and humility, I'd like to draw your attention to the 1963 case of Sherbert v. Werner, where the Supreme Court specifically addressed the balance between religious practice and governmental interest. Sister Anna Rossi stood ready to translate, but the Pope was handling the complex legal terminology with remarkable fluency. Cardinal Thomas Bennett watched his superior with barely concealed pride. He had known about the Holy Father's extensive legal knowledge, but seeing him deploy it with such precision was something else entirely. The years of dealing with international law, concordats, and various legal challenges were paying off in ways none of them had anticipated. Judge Blackwood removed his glasses, a gesture that Rachel Cooper, the court reporter, had seen countless times before. It usually signaled that the judge was preparing to either deliver a stern rebuke or acknowledge a compelling argument. The courtroom held its breath, waiting to see which it would be. Your Holiness, the judge began, his tone carrying a note of professional curiosity, you've clearly studied American constitutional law extensively. Please continue with your argument regarding religious expression in government buildings. The Pope nodded respectfully before proceeding. Thank you, Your Honor. The Supreme Court has consistently held that while government entities must maintain religious neutrality, This doesn't extend to prohibiting individual expression of faith through personal items or symbols, particularly when they are intrinsic to one's religious office and identity. Catherine Wilson, the law clerk, found herself cross-referencing the Pope's citations on her tablet. Each case he mentioned was not only relevant but perfectly applied to the current situation. This wasn't just about wearing a cross, it was about the fundamental balance between religious freedom and governmental neutrality. Furthermore, the Pope continued, his voice steady and clear, in Wisconsin versus Yoder, the court emphasized the importance of protecting religious practice when it doesn't substantially interfere with governmental functions. My papal cross, a symbol of both faith and office, creates no such interference. Officer James Sullivan, the bailiff, noticed how the other people waiting for their cases had become completely engrossed in the proceedings. Even those who had initially seemed annoyed by the delay were now watching with rapt attention as the leader of the Catholic Church delivered a constitutional law lecture worthy of a top law school. "Consider, Your Honor," the Pope went on, occasionally accepting Sister Anna's help with more complex legal phrases, the precedent set in Employment Division versus Smith. While it generally upheld neutral, generally applicable laws, it also recognized that religious freedom claims deserve particular solicitude, especially when combined with other constitutional protections. Elizabeth Morgan, the journalist, had already abandoned her notes about the other case she'd come to cover. This was the story: how the Supreme Pontiff had transformed a potential confrontation into a sophisticated legal discourse on constitutional rights. Bishop Michael Collins watched with growing admiration. He had always known of the Pope's intellectual prowess, but this display of American constitutional knowledge was revealing yet another layer of the Holy Father's scholarly depth. "Your Honor," the Pope continued, his passion for the subject evident in his voice, "I'd also like to address the concept of reasonable accommodation as established in Trans World Airlines versus Hardison. While that case dealt primarily with workplace religious accommodation, its principles regarding minimal burden and reasonable accommodation have been applied more broadly in public settings." Judge Blackwood's stern demeanor had gradually shifted to one of engaged interest. As a jurist who prided himself on thorough legal analysis, he couldn't ignore the sophistication of the argument being presented. "In my years serving the Church," the Pope added, "I've learned that every right comes with responsibility. I wear this cross not as a challenge to the court's authority or to make any public statement, but as an intrinsic symbol of my office and faith. The Supreme Court has repeatedly protected such expressions, provided they don't interfere with governmental functions." William Hayes, watching from his security post, noticed how even the other court officers had stopped their usual movements to listen. In all his years at the courthouse, he had never seen someone so effectively challenge Judge Blackwood's strict interpretations while maintaining absolute respect for the court. Gregory Phillips shifted in his position by the door, his mind going back to his law school days. He remembered studying some of these cases, but hearing them woven together by the Pope himself brought new meaning to the constitutional principles he had once memorized. "Consider, Your Honor," the Pope continued, the case of West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, where the Supreme Court emphasized that fundamental rights, including religious expression, shouldn't face special disabilities in the public sphere solely because of their religious nature. The morning had transformed into something none of the present parties had expected. Instead of a simple civil hearing or a confrontation over courtroom rules, they were witnessing a sophisticated discussion about the boundaries between religious expression and governmental neutrality. Rachel Cooper's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, knowing that this transcript would be requested and studied. This wasn't just about a cross or a civil matter anymore. It was about fundamental constitutional principles being articulated by an unexpected constitutional scholar. "The framers of your Constitution," the Pope said, his voice carrying the weight of historical understanding, understood that religious freedom doesn't mean religious absence. It means finding the balance between personal expression and institutional neutrality. "This cross represents not just personal expression, but the very office I hold." Judge Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Your Holiness, your knowledge of constitutional law is impressive. But tell me, what sparked this interest in American legal scholarship?" The question seemed to energize the Pope even further. Your Honor, in my role as Pope, I must understand the legal systems of many nations. But American constitutional law holds a special place in legal history, particularly in its approach to religious freedom. Each case I've cited represents part of humanity's ongoing struggle to balance individual rights with institutional authority. Elizabeth Morgan was already composing the opening lines of her article in her head. This wasn't just about a religious leader in court. This was about challenging assumptions and revealing the depths that lay beneath public personas. The morning had become a reminder that knowledge and understanding could come from unexpected sources, and that true strength often lay not in authority or position, but in the ability to articulate principles with clarity and conviction. Sister Anna Rossi watched with quiet joy as her translations became less and less necessary. The Pope's command of legal English, while accented, was proving more than adequate for this sophisticated discourse on constitutional law. As the sunlight continued to stream through the courthouse windows, those present realized they were witnessing more than just a legal argument. They were seeing a demonstration of how preparation, knowledge, and respect could transform a potential confrontation into a moment of shared understanding. The story of the Pope's unexpected legal expertise would soon spread beyond the confines of courtroom 7A, becoming a reminder that beneath every public image might lie depths of knowledge and understanding just waiting to be revealed. As the morning sun reached its zenith outside the courthouse windows, the atmosphere in courtroom 7A had transformed entirely. What had begun as a potential clash between judicial authority and religious expression had evolved into something far more significant. Judge Richard Blackwood, known throughout the Chicago legal community for his unwavering stance on courthouse protocols, found himself in an unprecedented position. The judge's expression had shifted from stern authority to thoughtful consideration as he studied the man before him. Pope John Paul II, still sitting with quiet dignity, had just delivered what amounted to a comprehensive analysis of religious freedom under constitutional law. The papal cross around his neck caught the light, seeming to underscore every point he had made about religious expression and faith. Catherine Wilson, the law clerk, had abandoned her tablet searches entirely. Every case the Pope had cited was not only relevant but perfectly contextualized. She found herself scribbling notes, not for the judge's reference, but for her own future study. This was a masterclass in constitutional interpretation that no one had expected. Your Holiness, Judge Blackwood spoke, breaking the charged silence that had fallen over the courtroom. You've presented a compelling argument about the intersection of religious expression and judicial authority. But let me pose a question to you. How do we balance individual rights with the need for judicial decorum? The question hung in the air, and Elizabeth Morgan, the journalist, leaned forward in her seat. This was the moment that would define the encounter, not just legally, but philosophically. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the Pope's response. Your Honor, the Pope began, his accented English carrying both authority and humility. Judicial decorum and religious freedom aren't opposing forces, they're complementary principles that strengthen each other. The same constitution that establishes judicial authority also protects religious expression. Cardinal Bennett watched his superior with quiet pride. The Holy Father had spent years studying legal systems around the world, but his grasp of American constitutional law was proving particularly impressive in this moment of challenge. Consider, the Pope continued, the Supreme Court's own courtroom, where religious symbols are displayed as part of America's cultural and legal heritage. The issue isn't the presence of religious expression, but rather its context and purpose. This cross is worn not to challenge authority, but as an essential symbol of the office I hold. Andrew Parker, the assistant district attorney, found himself nodding unconsciously. In his years of prosecution, he had rarely heard such a clear articulation of the balance between institutional authority and religious rights. The Pope's argument was becoming a lesson in constitutional law that any first-year law student would do well to study. Judge Blackwood removed his glasses again, this time placing them deliberately on his bench. You've clearly studied these principles extensively, Your Holiness. What drove you to develop such a deep understanding of American constitutional law? The question seemed to energize the Pope even further. Your Honor, as the head of the Catholic Church, I must understand how religious freedom is protected in different nations. The American experiment in religious liberty, enshrined in your First Amendment, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in balancing religious freedom with civil authority. Rachel Cooper's fingers continued their dance across her stenotype machine, knowing that this transcript would be requested not just by legal professionals, but by those interested in seeing a different side of the papal office. This wasn't just court reporting anymore. It was documenting a moment that challenged preconceptions about religious leadership and legal scholarship. The Constitution, the Pope continued, with Sister Anna occasionally helping with complex legal terms, is much like sacred text in one crucial aspect: every word matters, and interpretation requires understanding context, history, and intent. But unlike religious texts, the Constitution's impact on individual rights requires constant balancing of competing interests. Gregory Phillips, still watching from near the door, noticed how the other waiting cases had been forgotten. Everyone in the courtroom was absorbed in this unexpected dialogue between a Catholic pope and a secular judge about the foundations of American constitutional law. Your Honor, the Pope added, the Founding Fathers understood that true justice requires balancing competing principles. They created a system where religious freedom and institutional authority could coexist, each strengthening the other. My wearing this cross doesn't diminish the court's authority. If anything, the court's protection of religious expression enhances its authority by demonstrating fidelity to constitutional principles. Officer James Sullivan had never seen Judge Blackwood engage in such an extended dialogue with any defendant. But this was no ordinary exchange. It was a sophisticated discussion about the very principles that formed the foundation of American justice. The morning had revealed something that went beyond the immediate issue of wearing a religious symbol in court. It showed how knowledge, properly articulated and respectfully presented, could bridge the gap between religious freedom and judicial authority. Your Holiness, Judge Blackwood spoke again, his tone notably different from his earlier stern warnings. You've presented an articulate and well-reasoned defense of religious expression within institutional settings. But let me ask you this: how do we prevent this protection from becoming a precedent that might disrupt future proceedings? The Pope's response was immediate and measured. Your Honor, the Supreme Court has provided clear guidelines for distinguishing between protected religious expression and potentially disruptive displays. In Tinker v. Des Moines, which I mentioned earlier, the court established that expression is protected unless it materially and substantially interferes with appropriate discipline or operation. William Hayes, from his security post, noticed how even the other court officers had stopped their usual routines to listen. In all his years at the courthouse, he had never seen someone so effectively combine respect for authority with a defense of fundamental rights. Furthermore, the Pope continued, this court's authority to maintain decorum isn't diminished by allowing religious expression, it's enhanced by showing that such authority can coexist with constitutional protections. It's about finding the balance that the founders envisioned. Elizabeth Morgan had filled several pages of her notebook, knowing that this story would resonate far beyond the legal community. It was about challenging assumptions, about the unexpected depths that lay beneath public personas, and about the power of knowledge to transform confrontation into conversation. Bishop Collins watched with growing admiration as the Pope wove together theological understanding with constitutional principles, demonstrating how religious freedom and civil authority could strengthen rather than oppose each other. Judge Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The morning had not gone as he had expected. Instead of a simple matter of courtroom protocol, he had found himself engaged in one of the most intelligent discussions of constitutional principles he'd experienced in years. Your Honor, the Pope said, his voice carrying both conviction and respect. Throughout my ministry, I've learned that true authority isn't about domination, it's about understanding. The same principle applies to judicial authority. It's strongest when it protects the very rights it might seem to conflict with. The sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows had shifted, casting new patterns across the courtroom. Catherine Wilson noticed how the light caught the Pope's cross, transforming it from a point of contention into a symbol of something larger, the ongoing dialogue between religious freedom and institutional authority. The morning had become more than a legal proceeding. It had become a reminder that knowledge and understanding could come from unexpected sources, and that true justice required both wisdom and respect for fundamental rights. As the courtroom waited for Judge Blackwood's response, those present understood they were witnessing something rare, a moment when religious leadership, legal scholarship, and judicial authority had combined to create a deeper understanding of constitutional principles. The story of what happened next would soon spread through legal circles and beyond, becoming a reminder that sometimes the most powerful arguments come not from authority or position, but from a genuine understanding of the principles that govern our rights and responsibilities. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows through the windows of courtroom 7A. Judge Richard Blackwood sat in contemplative silence, his earlier rigid stance on courthouse protocols transformed by the morning's unexpected legal discourse. Before him, Pope John Paul II sat with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire defense, the papal cross around his neck no longer a point of contention but a symbol of something far more significant. "Your Holiness," Judge Blackwood finally spoke, his voice carrying a tone of professional respect that few in the courtroom had heard before. "In my years on the bench, I've heard countless arguments about religious expression and constitutional rights. But rarely have I encountered such a thoughtful and well-reasoned defense of religious freedom within institutional settings." The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Elizabeth Morgan, the journalist who had witnessed the entire exchange, knew she was about to record a moment that would challenge public perceptions of both judicial authority and religious leadership. "Before I make my ruling," the judge continued, "I want to address something you said earlier about the relationship between authority and individual rights. You suggested that true judicial authority is strengthened, not weakened, by protecting constitutional freedoms. Would you care to elaborate on that point?" The Pope nodded, his response carrying the same measured confidence that had characterized his entire defense. "Your Honor, the strength of your judicial system lies not in rigid enforcement of rules, but in its ability to balance competing principles. When a court protects religious freedom, even when it seems to challenge institutional authority, it demonstrates the very wisdom and fairness that gives that authority its legitimacy." Cardinal Bennett watched his superior with quiet pride. The years they had spent discussing constitutional law had revealed the Pope's genuine passion for legal principles, but today had transformed that private knowledge into public revelation. "In essence," the Pope continued, with Sister Anna providing occasional assistance with complex legal terms, "when this court considers my right to wear this cross, it's not just about religious expression. It's about the fundamental principle that justice requires understanding both the letter and the spirit of the law. The same Constitution that establishes this court's authority also protects religious freedom precisely because the founders understood that true justice needs both." Catherine Wilson, the law clerk, had long since abandoned her legal research. Every argument the Pope presented seemed to build on the previous ones, creating a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between religious freedom and judicial authority. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You've made reference throughout this hearing to various Supreme Court decisions. But what strikes me most is how you've woven these precedents into a coherent philosophy about the nature of justice itself. That's something many seasoned attorneys struggle to achieve." The courtroom remained silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just about a cross or a courtroom rule anymore. It had become a masterclass in constitutional interpretation and judicial philosophy. "Your Honor," the Pope responded, "in my ministry, I've often encountered situations where religious freedom seems to conflict with civil authority. But studying law taught me that true justice comes through understanding. Every Supreme Court case I cited today tells part of a larger story about how your legal system balances authority with freedom, tradition with progress, institutional needs with individual rights." Andrew Parker, the assistant district attorney, found himself taking notes. In his years of prosecution, he had never heard constitutional principles explained with such clarity and practical application. This was the kind of argument that would be discussed in law schools. "The founders," the Pope continued, created a system where justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding why those rules exist and how they serve both individual liberty and institutional authority. This cross represents my religious office, but defending my right to where it speaks to something larger, the ongoing dialogue between religious freedom and societal order that makes your legal system unique. Rachel Cooper's fingers continued their dance across her stenotype machine, knowing that this transcript would be requested not just by legal professionals but by anyone interested in seeing how knowledge and respect could transform a potential confrontation into a moment of shared understanding. Judge Blackwood removed his glasses one final time, placing them deliberately on his bench. "Your Holiness, you've done more than defend your right to wear a religious symbol. You've provided this court with a thoughtful examination of how religious freedom and judicial authority can coexist and strengthen each other." The afternoon light had shifted, casting a warm glow across the courtroom. Gregory Phillips, still watching from his position near the door, noticed how the shadows had changed since the morning's initial confrontation. It seemed fitting, a physical representation of how perspectives had shifted throughout the day. "Therefore," Judge Blackwood continued, "I find not only that you have the right to wear your cross in this courtroom, but that your defense of that right has contributed to this court's understanding of constitutional principles. The fine is dismissed, and I would like the record to reflect the thoroughness and respect with which you presented your arguments." The tension that had filled the courtroom all morning finally broke, replaced by a sense of witnessing something remarkable. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a demonstration of how knowledge, properly articulated and respectfully presented, could bridge the gap between religious freedom and judicial authority. Officer James Sullivan, who had watched the entire proceedings, realized he had just witnessed something that went beyond his initial discomfort at the confrontation. This was a different kind of strength, the power of knowledge, understanding, and respectful discourse. "Your Honor," the Pope spoke one final time, "thank you for allowing me to present this defense. It's reminded me that justice is served best when we take the time to understand not just our rights, but the principles behind them." As the judge nodded in acknowledgement, Elizabeth Morgan was already composing the opening lines of her article. This story wasn't just about a religious leader avoiding a fine, it was about challenging assumptions, revealing hidden depths, and demonstrating how constitutional principles came alive when properly understood and articulated. William Hayes, who had seen countless cases from his security post, understood that this day would be remembered not for its outcome, but for its reminder that justice required both wisdom and respect for fundamental rights. "This court is adjourned," Judge Blackwood announced, but his tone carried something more than mere dismissal. It carried recognition of how this ordinary civil matter had transformed into an extraordinary lesson in constitutional law and judicial philosophy. Sister Anna Rossi, who had watched her translations become less necessary as the Pope demonstrated his command of legal English, knew she had witnessed a moment that would be remembered in both legal and religious circles. As the participants prepared to leave courtroom 7A, they understood they had witnessed more than just a legal argument. They had seen how knowledge, respect, and understanding could transform potential conflict into meaningful dialogue. The story of Pope John Paul II courtroom defense would soon spread beyond the confines of the Chicago Federal Court, becoming a reminder that beneath every public image might lie unexpected depths of knowledge and understanding. It proved that true strength often lies not in authority or position, but in the ability to articulate principles with clarity and conviction. For those who had witnessed it, this day would remain a powerful reminder that justice is served best when knowledge meets respect, when authority encounters understanding, and when the letter of the law is illuminated by the spirit of wisdom. Bishop Collins watched with quiet satisfaction as the Pope gathered his papers, understanding that they had witnessed not just a legal victory, but a demonstration of how religious leadership could engage with civil authority in a way that elevated both. As the Pope rose to leave, the cross around his neck caught the afternoon light one final time. It had become more than a religious symbol. It was now a reminder that sometimes the most powerful arguments come not from force or authority, but from a deep understanding of the principles that govern both our rights and our responsibilities. The story of what happened in courtroom 7A that day would be retold many times, serving as a testament to the power of knowledge, the importance of respectful discourse, and the enduring principle that true justice requires both wisdom and understanding. Let us know in the comments if you've ever encountered a situation where knowledge and understanding helped transform a confrontation into a moment of shared wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that true strength often comes in unexpected forms.